Divorce preparations are complete. I've left the divorce papers, bank book, and seal along with a letter expressing my gratitude and apologies for our time together on the desk. I don't intend to ask for any alimony, and I think that handing over the savings, furniture, and appliances should be enough for her to forget me. To my wife, who's perhaps working the night shift, farewell. She's a nurse. When I say she might be on the night shift, I mean that's what she tells me, but I don't actually check her schedule myself, so I don't know if it's true. Maybe she's just at work, or maybe she's pretending to work to spend time with her lover. I could always call the ward to find out, I suppose. But considering the flurry of emails that have been coming in since midday, it seems like she really was at work. As for why I chose to divorce, well, to make the long story short, it's because of my wife's infidelity. It seems she's fallen for another man, and he appears to be very keen on her as well. Given our history, I'm more of a liability to my wife than anything, and I don't feel like I have the right to demand alimony, so I plan to give her everything I can and gracefully step aside. That was the plan, at least, but things have gotten a bit complicated. I'm a 35-year-old office worker, and my wife is a 32-year-old nurse. We've been married for 6 years, and we don't have any kids. The other man is single and her colleague. I don't know his age, but I think he's around our age. I've never cheated, but my wife, who knows? If you ask me whether we should split up or rebuild our relationship, I'd choose divorce without hesitation. It all started when I noticed a change in my wife's demeanor. Accessory. I happened to glance at her phone and confirmed through the mass of emails and photos that she was indeed having an affair. I decided to step aside, both for my wife's future happiness and as penance for my own past. After 4 months of preparation, I left the divorce papers and bank book at home and moved out last week. Now, my wife is calling and emailing me to apologize, saying she wants to start over. Before I met my wife, I had been in relationships with 3 other women, all of which ended because of their infidelity. That experience left me distrustful of women, and I fell deep into gambling. Actually, this led to financial difficulties, and eventually I ended up in debt. It was around this time that I met my now wife, who for some reason pursued me aggressively. As I was honest with her about my past and told her that I didn't trust women, but she wouldn't take no for an answer. I started dating her somewhat reluctantly, figuring she would just leave me eventually anyway. After a year into our relationship, I found myself deeply in love with my wife. We were both nearing the end of our 20s, and seeing our friends getting married made me yearn for a happy family life. But in reality, I was saddled with debt and had little income. The guilt of keeping my debt a secret from my wife was becoming unbearable, and they decided it would be best for her happiness if I left her. But when I tried to break up with her, she refused to accept my vague reasons for leaving. I tried to make up an excuse and leave, but my wife wouldn't let it slide. Somehow, in my confusion, I ended up spilling the beans about my debt and how much I owed. Sometime later, she called me to meet up. I refused at first, but when she threatened to tell my parents about my debt, I reluctantly agreed. As soon as my wife saw me, she abruptly handed me an envelope and said, do you want to pay off your debt with this money and marry me? Or should we go to your parents' house now and tell them about your debt? Which one would you prefer? I didn't want to take her money, but I also didn't want my parents to find out about my debt. I gave in to her pressure and accepted the money, using it to repay my debt. After that, I moved in with my wife, and she took over our finances. I paid her back in monthly installments with whatever money I could spare. Thanks to her, I was able to limit my gambling to what I could afford with my allowance. Finished paying her back just before I turned 30, and we were finally able to get married. We didn't have much money though, so we couldn't have a wedding ceremony, and we could only afford cheap wedding rings, no engagement ring. I felt bad about that. Our married life was peaceful. We continued living in the cheap apartment we had been sharing, and when my wife turned 30, we learned something. We hadn't been particularly keen on having kids after getting married, but we also weren't using any contraception, and we had agreed to let nature take its course. But then one day it's surprisingly hard to get pregnant, isn't it? There was solid evidence that my wife was cheating on me. The man she was having an affair with was a man who had come to play at our house in the past, and he was my wife's colleague. From the texts alone, it was already clear that they had a sexual relationship. But when I looked back, there were pictures sent from the man. The picture was actually a picture of my half-naked wife, sleeping after having fun. But it seemed to be a shot taken without her knowing, and there was a furious reply from my wife after it. Also, there were many texts from the man asking her to divorce and marry him. My heart was about to break at that point, but my heart completely broke when I saw my wife's reply to the man's sudden marriage proposal. My wife's reply was, "I'm happy with you, but I can't leave my husband now." She didn't intend to divorce, but at that time, I couldn't help but think that I was the one hindering my wife's happiness. From then on, I did my best to prepare for divorce and create lasting memories. As for preparations for divorce, I secured a new house and made decisions about what to do with our assets. There was no trace of squandering savings. The man has a considerable income and seems to be a bachelor nobleman, so it is assumed that the man paid all the dating expenses. I don't intend to get alimony from my wife or the man, and I've decided to give all the furniture and appliances to my wife, including savings. I moved my personal belongings to my new house. It was a bit lonely that my wife didn't notice at all. As in memory making, in the spring we went on a trip, although it was domestic, and on our anniversary, for the first time, I booked a restaurant with a dress code. It's a strange story, but I also devoted myself to fun times with my wife at night. At the same time, I was doing something that was the opposite of making memories, like disposing of old photos, all the photos of me, and even in my wife's cell phone. 4 months passed in a flash, and the last day with my wife arrived. My wife was on night shift that day. I usually take a bath and go to bed as soon as I get home from night shift, but thinking that it was the last time with my wife, I couldn't sleep and decided to make lunch for her. It turned out to be a breakfast-like meal with toast, omelets, and salad, but my wife, who was surprised to see me awake, had lunch with me. Lapsed out an hour passed while we were talking about silly things, and my wife had to go to work. After seeing off my wife, I finished the dishes and even took care of the laundry, which I usually left untouched. Actually, when I finally took a moment to relax on the sofa, the tears welled up for the first time. I cried and cried like a fool, and when I randomly looked at the television, which was turned off, I saw my own foolish face reflected and couldn't help but laugh. That night, after a short nap, and before leaving our home, I filled out the divorce papers we had previously prepared and left them, along with a bank book, a stamp, and a letter. Acceptory in the letter, I apologized for my past and expressed my gratitude for the times we'd spent together. I also mentioned that I knew about her affair, but had no intention of blaming her for it. I wrote that I wanted her to be happy and that I was willing to pay alimony even if it had to be in small installments. Moving to a new place, I felt a small sense of relief thinking that I had done all I could, albeit for my own satisfaction. As for the alimony, I thought it was a fair trade-off for pulling me out of the pits of debt and setting me back to a normal life. Since leaving the house, I've stopped answering calls and blocked her text messages, dealing only with emails and refusing requests for reconciliation. When she asked to meet and talk, I told her I needed some time and didn't tell her where I was staying. But despite this, when I got home from work, my wife was standing at the entrance of my new home, a place I hadn't even told my parents about. As soon as she saw me, she fell to her knees crying. With the eyes of our neighbors on us, I reluctantly let her into the house. Once inside, she prostrated herself again. Hence, even when I took her to the living room, she stayed in that position, not engaging in any conversation. I made her some tea to calm her down, and after about 5 minutes, she seemed to collect herself and pulled out something from her bag. It was 2 bank books and 2 oddly swollen envelopes. One of the bank books was the one I'd left behind. It had nearly twice the average amount of alimony, but the other was her personal bank book, which I didn't look into. The envelopes contained $14,000 from her parents and $21,000 as alimony from the man she had been having the affair with. She pleaded for another chance, prostrating herself again. I was overwhelmed, but I told her that I would have a proper discussion with her later, and could not accept the money now. I also told her that she should take it back. She was crying, and there was a scared look in her eyes. How should I handle this to keep things amicable? I considered taking the money and divorcing her, then continuing to ignore her afterwards. Wouldn't she just end up with the other man? I don't want the money, and it would make all my 4 months of effort go to waste. Why on earth would she come back to me when I had cast myself as the villain and agreed to divorce on favorable terms? It makes no sense. I can forgive her for the affair, but it would still be painful to stay with her. I may feel sorry for her now, but my anger could eventually overpower the guilt, and honestly, I don't know what I might do then. That's why I want to leave. And the fact that there is also alimony from the other man, does that mean she broke up with him? And who's going to take care of her now? At that lead to Vitam CPT, the fact that there was money from her parents, does that mean she told them about the affair? I wrote in the letter that she should gloss over the reason for our divorce and not tell her parents. She has never been honest with her parents. I'm getting more and more confused. I knew my wife loved children, and I've seen her depressed after our friends came over with their kids. We even talked about adopting, but she said it would be irresponsible to take in a child who isn't our own, that she wanted a child from me, not just any child. How could I say anything when she said that while crying? Given that I did promise to have a proper discussion, I think it would be disrespectful to my wife, who has dedicated so much to me, to simply retract that offer. Therefore, if the next conversation doesn't go well, I'll consider seeking advice from a lawyer. I believe it's crucial to communicate directly and not just through letters. I still haven't even heard her reasons for the infidelity. The Totoro I can somewhat guess. At first I thought that once I left, things would resolve on their own, because she was likely completely engrossed in the affair. My actions over the past 4 months have been my own way of showing gratitude for her support up until now, but when presented with an unexpected request for reconciliation and suddenly being shown a large sum of money I'd never seen before, anyone would panic and feel confused. Still, it's important to settle things right. If so, I shouldn't let the other man escape without paying his dues either. It might not have been pure love after all. That realization hit me hard. Maybe I just wanted to end things cleanly, as if all this never happened. As part of the settlement, I'll require the other man and my wife to compensate me with alimony. I'll be sure to make it clear that I'm not considering reconciliation, and I'll firmly conclude my relationship with my wife. I plan to discuss things with my wife as soon as possible, so for now I've arranged to meet her the following night. I had a brief, free consultation with a lawyer yesterday, and we agreed that they would represent me if things got messy. By the way, it seems my wife has visited my parents' home because my mother contacted me. We finished our discussion, but unfortunately, it ended in a deadlock. My wife has said she will pay damages and will continue to make amends for the rest of her life. However, I refuse to divorce. She said, I also summoned the other man. At first, he claimed he was too busy with work, but he came over within 30 minutes when I told him I'd come to pick him up. But the other man said, I'll pay damages, but I want you to divorce your wife. But I want to marry her. Even my wife's parents, who I asked not to get involved, showed up. Her father was about to punch the other man as soon as he saw him, especially after being called Dad by him. Her parents expressed a wish for reconciliation between us and offered to do whatever they could to help. I told my wife's parents everything I've done to her in the past. Afterwards, I explained how their lives would become easier with an increased income if my wife and the other man got together, and that they could still have their grandchild. Although they were a bit hesitant, they began to persuade my wife. But despite the three of them trying to convince her, my wife didn't agree. After a 4-hour discussion, we ended without any resolution. My wife admitted the affair had been going on for about a year, and her only reason was she couldn't resist the temptation. The other man had always liked my wife and had given up because she was married. He was the one who initiated the affair, and he instantly agreed. And from now on, our discussions will go through the lawyer. For now, I've told them my terms. I don't need any money from my wife, just an equal division of our assets and a restraining order. The other man must pay the $35,000 he proposed, and after that, he can do as he pleases. Tomorrow, officially hire the lawyer. I still care about my wife and want her to be happy, but I hope that happiness will come with someone other than me. I'm too emotionally fragile to live in constant fear of infidelity. To be honest, a part of me felt relieved when her infidelity was confirmed. I've realized that reality isn't as sweet as it seems. It might sound laughable, but that's what I told her. Now, it might just be harassment from my wife. I've clearly communicated my thoughts. I told her that I didn't want her to give up on the happiness that comes with having and raising a child. I wonder if that comment was the wrong thing to say. I thought that if I hired a lawyer, I could delegate all future interactions with my wife, but the lawyer told me to not ignore any communications from her, but to handle them amicably. This was quite the contrary to my intention of severing all contact. It seemed I had no choice but to communicate via my lawyer. As for the man my wife cheated with, we seemed to be settling things with an out-of-court settlement. The agreement stipulates that he pays me $35,000 in damages, and they won't report the matter to his workplace. He also has to cease all contact with me, and I have decided to not concern myself with the affair between my wife and him anymore. The terms are all in my favor, and the man didn't dispute them at all. The lawyer said that the amount of damages is quite enough. The man seems to be planning to marry my wife. She seems to be avoiding him at work and ignoring his messages. As the dust settles, I don't feel as upset as when I found out about the affair or when I decided to divorce. I start to wonder whether I ever really loved my wife. $35,000 is a lot to me if he wants to pay that much to be with my wife. Well, more power to him. Power to him. I received the payment from him almost immediately. I was surprised to see that much money in my account. But that I'm done dealing with the man. It seems like my wife is still holding on. I will absolutely not divorce, even telling the lawyer. The lawyer advised me that if this goes to mediation, bringing up past issues may not work in my favor. I still receive meek messages from my wife, but I just tell her to contact me through the lawyer. Sometimes she lays in wait for me on my way home, and her intense demeanor scares me a bit. I honestly don't want this to drag on. It's been 2 weeks since I left the house, and the thought of this going on for months or even years gives me chills. I may have to consider moving far away to sever ties completely. I've been thinking about quitting my job and moving away, but I have a lot of anxiety about a new location and job. And then the worst thing happened. I got a call from my mother during a night shift, saying that my wife was at the house. She told me to come over once I finished work. What a hassle. I reluctantly went to my parents' home, and my wife gave me the divorce papers she had already filled out. She won't be paying any alimony. She's given up on dividing the assets, so I will be keeping our savings. But she wants no restraining order. Not that I have any intention of seeing her. Actually, I had intended to give her a piece of my mind when I saw her at my parents' home, but it seemed my mother had already done so. I didn't have to say anything. I planned to submit the divorce papers soon and end our relationship. When I arrived at my parents' home and opened the front door, my wife was there, kneeling in apology. I stared at her, thinking not this again, when she raised her head. "I accept the divorce," I said. "I'm truly sorry," she replied. I was taken aback, not expecting her to say that. As I stood there, stunned, my mother came out from the back with an indescribable expression on her face. We went inside and had a conversation, during which my wife said her parents had urged her to divorce me quickly and marry the other man. But after hearing what my mother had to say, she changed her mind. She realized she wouldn't be forgiven, so she agreed to the divorce and promised to make amends as much as possible. But she asked that we maintain some sort of connection, even if it's just as acquaintances. I had told my mother about the divorce and the reasons for it, but there was a reason she hadn't interfered. It turns out my mother had an affair in the past. I found out as a child when I accidentally saw a note about it in her planner, but I chose to believe my mother wouldn't do something like that and ignored it. But as an adult, after a series of relationship failures, my mother comforted me and revealed her past affair. That brought back memories, and I ended up harshly blaming my mother. My mother apologized profoundly, and upon deep reflection, I realized that my deceased father was much the same as me with his debts, so it couldn't be helped. I reluctantly came to terms with it. My mom talked about this with my wife, saying I also had an affair in the past. I rashly told our son about it and hurt him deeply. He told me he would never forgive me, and I regret my actions. Even though we get along on the surface, I can feel that he hasn't forgotten about it and that he hasn't forgiven me. I don't believe he will ever forgive you either. That seems to be what she said. As for the casual acquaintance-level relationship my wife asked for, it was nothing more than a verbal promise, and to be frank, I have no intention of keeping it. Since I don't know when I might bump into her anymore, I've explained the situation to my boss and am in the process of being transferred to a different state. Once the transfer is finalized, I won't be physically running into her anymore, so that's why I just responded vaguely to my wife's words. And with all that, I finished submitting the divorce papers. I finished saying my goodbyes and am now officially divorced. I'm not sure if it's because of handling the divorce papers at the city hall or because I was running around after a night shift, but I'm exhausted. However, I'm determined to keep working hard from tomorrow onward so that I don't revert back to my old crappy self. There's no doubt that the person who saved me from my past was my wife, and I'm truly grateful for that. I sincerely want her to be happy. I made her struggle financially. I made her endure hardships because of my infertility and simply because she met me. I made her go through many unnecessary hardships. Of course, that doesn't mean I can forgive her betrayal, but I am deeply grateful to her nonetheless. That's why, from now on, I want her to be happier than ever before. I feel bad for making my mom recall those unpleasant memories of the past. I haven't completely forgiven her, but I don't want to hurt her any more than I already have. So I've decided to leave things be. Thank you for watching the video all the way to the end. If you resonated with the content, please leave a positive rating and a comment.